Right.
There you go.
So, a series on standing up a CoE, or what is a CoE in UiPath. And today we're going to talk about roles. But if you were on the call yesterday, I'm just going to click through this stuff. We ended the call with some late minute questions about change management scope creep in a agile system. And I wanted to address how I and how I teach to handle scope creep and how I teach change management. So I wanted to touch on that before we got into roles. So change control process is typically going to fall on the shoulders of your business analyst, unless you are the developer slash business analyst slash solution architect. Change control I categorize into three different concepts. And it's funny that I did do this and I followed this because this is also ironically how UiPath teaches it. Coincidentally, sorry, but great minds, right? So a standard change is a change that doesn't alter your process design document. And typically when we talk about change in a SDLC, software development lifecycle, we talk about when that process design document is signed off. And in the period from sign off to the period from when you start developing, you can change that process design document. It may go back to the beginning of being developed, but you can still change it. Once that process design document, if you're building from a functional document or you're building from that process and you start build, then change is kind of cut off or limited. So I limit my changes to prevent scope creep to a standard change. Standard changes need no approval because they don't change your business process. Hey, I want a log message included here. Hey, I want a message box included here. Something small that doesn't change that process. Standard change, it's documented by the developer in the TDD, technical design document. Other people call it an SDD. I always refer to it as a TDD. It's a deliverable at the end of your project. A normal change requires approval. It is a change in your process. It's a change in your PDD. That requires approval and justification and documentation from your process owner or SME and approval from your CoE, your CoE lead. So typically in that kind of situation, a developer is going to set that aside and wait for that change to flow through if it does. Normally on a normal change, we're going to kick that to the end and say, okay, if you want this, this is going to be something we're going to do after the fact. We're going to put this into production and we'll do this after the fact. Now let's talk about technical debt when we talk about these changes, especially normal changes. You may be in a situation where you are given a deadline. I want this developed in 4 weeks, or I want this functionality in 4 weeks, and the rest of the functionality in the PDD can take 8 weeks. We call that extra 4 weeks technical debt. And that's a little bit different. And if you haven't dealt with technical debt, you're going to deal with that in more often. You're going to deal with that if you're working for a consultancy firm, or you're working for an outside builder, or you're working in the federal government sector. Emergency change is typically something that's going to involve a system. Rarely are you going to have a business exception, business rule exception that's an emergency change. Emergency change would be something that before you've started working that system, no one ever thought would happen. And it's going to fault your automation. And you as a developer need to make that change in order for the automation to proceed. That's an emergency change and does not need approval. It's critical to the success of your automation. And it's something that the developer is going to document in his TDD. So before I go on, and we're going to talk about roles today. Before I go on, does anybody have any questions about changes that was perhaps on this call yesterday? All right. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Today we're talking about roles in your CoE. Now, again, like I mentioned yesterday, I'm talking to you from a high level about ideal roles in a utopian world. These are not roles that you may initially need in your CoE. They may be roles that you add as you scale your CoE, but these are the roles you'll normally find in a CoE. We're going to talk about the roles, their definition, then we're going to walk a process kind of through how it works in a CoE with these roles. All right. Your sponsor, that's the individual in your organization that is championing. Usually this is going to be a C-suite individual, CTO, CIO, CFO. And in my experience, it's been most commonly the CFO. That's the one that can make changes to the organizational policy to allow RPA and UiPath or any other automation tools, be it Power Platform, AA, Blue Prism, to actually enter into the organization's ecosystem and start being an operational solution. Evangelizers are going to be your directors and other people you've worked with that you've built for. And they're going to be the ones that are going to say, oh, yeah, RPA is great. This is what they did for us. That's your evangelizers. Your CoE manager is the guy that runs, or the person that runs your CoE, your administrator. Now, this could be a solution architect, which we'll get to in a minute. It could be a developer, analyst / solution architect, depending on the size of your CoE, whether you're starting off early, whether you're well developed, whether you're trying to integrate into another organizational CoE, which is a higher level CoE. Your CoE manager is totally focused on your RPA CoE and the success of that CoE and the mission of that CoE and the guidelines that you set up when you envision this CoE. That's your CoE manager. And that manager is also going to help allocate workload, allocate business analysts, and help prioritize your pipeline. And that CoE manager is typically going to be part of your steering committee. Technical architects are going to be the people you rely on from IT that spin up the servers, maintain the servers. They may do source control deployments into your branches. They may control your production environment. It depends on how your IT system's set up. So your technical architects are going to be those experts that deal with cloud and things like that you don't necessarily want to or know how to deal with. You're going to find these technical experts. You're going to recruit these technical experts, and they're going to be part of your CoE. And these technical experts, architects, experts, whatever it might be, are going to be very critical to the success of your CoE. All right, because servers go down, server patches happen. I know that if you're working in a Microsoft server and you're using Outlook, you will get a patch once a month without notice from Microsoft that may alter the way that your bot is able to interact with your emails. So these technical architects are the people that you rely on to check for that on a regular basis and make sure it continues to operate like it should. And there was an instance where I worked in a CoE where I was also the technical architect. So I was the person that was monitoring this. And so it becomes quite a workload because being a technical architect is a very heavy lift. Maintenance. I've worked with and consulted with CoEs where they had an entirely different maintenance division, maintenance function, where they had people that just maintained opportunities. And this is very critical. We'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about architecture, is development standards for your developers, that they all follow the same rigor, they all follow the same annotations, and they all follow the same way of labeling and using RE framework and things like that. Because in some CoEs, after you build, your developer's done, and that shoots off to a maintenance team that needs to maintain those automations as systems change or business rules change, things like that. Solution architect is probably going to be one of the most important people in your CoE. This is the person that's going to actually work with your business team that wants the automation from the kickoff of the project until the closure of the project. This person is involved in everything. And this is different than your project manager. A solution architect is going to be more intimate with the business process, the automation tools. These are often people that have progressed beyond being RPA developers, and they've taken classes or training to be either a UiPath certified solution architect or in some other fashion. So in my world, for example, I solution architect for federal agencies. So I'm not only involved in the RFIs, the RFQs, the ROMs, and the orals and the presentations. So I'm intimately aware with what I've said we can do based on what our capabilities are as an organization. That solution architect is one of the most key people in your CoE. Information security, again, we talked about that yesterday. This is the one person that's going to be critical in handling GRC models, tracking your bots activities in an ERP system such as SAP or Oracle or Microsoft 365D. These are people that are going to be in charge of multi-factor authentication and getting past that, CyberArk, credential controls, things like those. These are very critical. So information security, this guy and technical architects are key to your CoE. A solution architect is often sometimes a developer and sometimes even a business analyst, sometimes even the CoE manager. But as you scale and you grow your CoE, you'll definitely want to consider having a separate role for solution architect. Developers, we used to think that we were the key to RPA, that we were the key to UiPath, that nothing got done without us, and that's not true. We are a cog in the wheel. And when UiPath started in, I think I've been working with it since 2014, 2015, a long time, since my son was in high school, freshman in high school. UiPath, the developers used to be the only role you had in UiPath. And UiPath back then was new, it was growing. We didn't have the platform, we didn't have anything like that. I will tell you a story. My UiPath experience started on, and I may have told you this yesterday, I don't know if I did or not, VM12, Virtual Machine 12, and Virtual Machine 12 was attached to my computer. So when I developed and when I needed to run something, I had to step away from my keyboard and let the bot take over my system. That's how early stage UiPath was at the time. So developers have now grown to be where we build from functional diagrams, PDDs, with pictures of keystrokes and pictures of the screenshots that we would be encountering when we're in a system. And these are all put together by the business analysts. And sometimes your business analysts are developers and they handle the whole thing. It depends on your contract or the opportunity you're working on or your organization. Business analysts are, if you're scaling, you'll want a business analyst that knows the organization, knows how to navigate the leadership in the organization, knows how to navigate documentation if it's there. Especially if you are automating for a very large, very complicated, complex organization with multiple missions or multiple deliverable products or things like that, like a ConAgra, a Dell, or PepsiCo, where you have multiple, you own multiple brands. A business analyst is kind of critical. These are the people that are going to interact directly with the business teams. They're going to build your process design documents. They're going to be involved in the life cycle of your automation during the technical solution part, working with the SMEs and the process owners, all the way to delivery. They kind of step out during development, except when it comes to change control, like we talked about in the first slide that was left over from yesterday. Your business analysts are going to be the people that build your UAT testing plans, your scripts, what you're testing for, what exceptions you want to test for, what successes you want to test for. These people are critical because the developer in a defined and robust CoE, the developer is building. And the developer has very limited contact with the business team. The business analyst and the developer work very closely, and the business analyst is the person that has built those relationships with the business team and is the go-between there. So really defined change. And the business analyst, if we think about that first slide I talked about on change, the business analyst is in charge of that change control, those normal, those standard, and those emergency changes that you need in your automation. That's the business analyst's job. And they should be developing something called a change matrix, which is just a spreadsheet that says, these are the changes requested, these are the changes approved, these are the changes that we're going to incorporate, that kind of deal. This guy is a very critical part of a scalable or a scaled CoE testing. Typically, when we build as developers, we do what we call functional testing. We'll go out and we'll consume some test data that's provided by this guy and the process owner. We'll consume some data while we build. And we do this through debugging, and we do this through functional testing. We build in code segments. Remember, we don't build from start to end. We break that into code segments for maintenance. And as we build our code segments, if you're working in an agile sprint environment, or if you're not, you're testing those code segments as you go, right? So testing is usually functional when it comes to developers, and I call that alpha testing. And then when we do UAT testing, or we may have that, I have a CoE I consulted on that had an entirely different testing team than a UAT testing team. And in his model, his testing team retested the functional testing that the developer did, tested several different code segments together, and then tested everything together before they turn it over to a UAT team for testing. So your testing person is involved with anything in a very well-developed CoE, a large CoE. If you have a separate testing team, these guys are sitting in test suite every day just testing. Now, they're not doing UAT or building any UAT testing scripts. That, again, is the job of the business analyst. And the business analyst builds separate testing scripts for a UAT team and a testing team. And there are actually roles out there where people take courses and certifications just to be UAT test leads and set up a UAT testing program. So it's an entire discipline now when it comes to software development, especially in an automation or generative AI scenario where you have a separate UAT tester, a UAT tester developer, I guess is what they would be called. All right, let's talk about the leadership of your role. So your steering committee may be totally separate than your sponsor and evangelist, or they may be all within your executive steering committee or your steering committee. A lot of times an evangelist will be somebody that let me back up. Let's say you went into an organization and you're looking primarily at adoption of RPA. So you may build some automations for an individual. Let's say you're building automations for an Amy Day or a Tara Taylor or someone like that. And these people are just using these individual automations you built, and they become your evangelists, because then these people, these Amy's and Kara's, will go out and say to John and James and Brandon, hey, you should try and do this with RPA because it works for me, and this is what it did for me, and this is how much time it saved for me. So your evangelists may not even sit in your steering committee. They may be your functional directors we talked about yesterday, your division leaders, your vice presidents that have seen the impact in their organization or their segment of the organization, their silo or their vertical, whatever it may be, their horizontal, where they've actually experienced the cost savings and the FTE savings and the ideation that can come about from FTEs actually sitting around a conference table coming up with ideas or strategies. So your CoE manager interacts with every one of these roles, regardless of how it's structured in your steering committee. Remember, from last night, your steering committee is structured at the onset when you set your vision for the RPA CoE. And that steering committee is fluid and flexible, and it can change, but your CoE manager is responsible for interacting with all of these people. And that is the person. Your developer is not going to necessarily interact with your steering committee unless that person is a lead developer or a practice manager and sits on your steering committee. Your developers, your lower developers, your junior developers, your mid-level developers probably would never interact with these people. They're building automation. And that to some people may seem very limited and kind of boring. And you have some people out there that just want to do that. I remember we at an organization I was with decided that we wanted to cross-train developers as also business analysts. And business analysts, we wanted to see if they were technical, functional, and train them as developers. And some developers don't want to do that. They just want to sit there and develop. So some of those developers will never see these people. All right. Let's talk about an automation within this process. And this looks overwhelming. Don't cry. Don't panic. I'll kind of explain each step. So your business is your first step. Your business process owner, your SME, your divisional functional leaders will come up with pipelines or opportunities in the pipeline that they want developed. And remember, these have gone through the steering committee and that have been prioritized, whether you use Automation Hub from UiPath to do the prioritization of these, to gather ideas, to flesh out those ideas, or you use process mining or task mining for PDD development. Your first step is the business. They're the key part of building that pipeline. Your business analyst then comes into play and works with your business to define the technical aspects of that process. What do you do now? What's your as-is process flow? What steps do you take? Let me watch what you do. Let's record what you do with Task Manager. Let's see your steps. Let's build those steps with task mining. So I can see exactly what exceptions, what the developer is going to encounter when we build this. Then your solution architect comes into play, and he's working with both your business analyst, as you can see the arrow there, going back and forth, and your solution architect also has a back and forth arrow to your business, because remember, this guy is critical in a well-developed CoE. This is the person that has gone with the business analyst, met with the process owners during kickoff, is intimate with the process by an interaction between this little circle here, is very intimate with this process, understands the ins and outs of what the UiPath platform or whatever instance you have is capable of, what your company's paying for, what your bot utilization is, what your current run rates are, what your current time constraints are. If you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10 bots, or maybe more. I have a friend of mine who works in the Walmart labs, Store 8, that builds UiPath. They have 500 bots just alone that process things in Walmart. So when you go into Walmart and you walk down the aisle and you see pieces of paper tacked on the shelves, that on empty shelves saying this is where we're going to move things, those are done by bots. When you go into Walmart and you do a self-checkout, those are processed by UiPath RPA bots. So this whole process is primarily done between your solution architect, your business analyst, and your business. Here we are, if you identify as a developer, here we are down here. You can see that we're not part of the overall important process. We're important because we're building. And these developer tests and maintains. In some models, you may have a CoE, like I said, where you have a separate maintenance function. In some CoEs, you have a separate testing function. And in some CoEs, the developer does the testing, the maintaining, and the business analyst part, and the solution architect part. If you have a dotted line, the business analyst here is rarely going to be involved in this part. This guy will be involved. Your solution architect will be involved in the development and testing and maintaining of your automations. Your business analyst kind of sits back here and is working on your testing scripts, your testing plan with your business over here, and with your solution architect. Hope I'm not confusing you with all my lines here. Your technical architect, your developer will have a dotted line to your technical architect. Typically, your developers can go to either the business analyst or the solution architect and say, hey, I'm having some system problems here that we didn't encounter, or I need to test this in my virtual machine or my virtual server. And I need him to open up some things with me and load some things in with for me so I can test in my virtual server, which is available in UiPath. Your technical architect has a dotted line here. You may consult as a developer this guy. Okay. And it depends on your role as a developer. If you're wearing multiple hats as a developer, you'll be in constant contact with your technical architects and your InfoSec guy. Okay. You'll be in constant contact with those people. If you're not, these guys are going to be in constant contact. Your solution architect, your technical architect, and your InfoSec guy, not your business analyst. This is your key role when it comes to this stuff, your architecture and your InfoSec. Now, let me, like I said, when I build architecture, I consider training and I consider standards and things like that as part of an architecture and not part of roles, because those are, to me, those are systems. So we'll cover those off on Monday. But just so you have in mind that these guys are going to most often in a well-developed CoE talk with this guy. Okay. And again, this guy may be your CoE manager who's solutioning opportunities. Okay. All right. So these guys will only be involved in develop, test, and maintain, typically. Your InfoSec guy and your technical architect, because once their roles are done for that automation, they're not really worried in testing and maintaining and maintenance and things like that. Now, this guy, technical architect, may be involved in deployment if you're using Azure version control in DevOps, or you're using Git. Those may be for the sake of integrity and security, may be locked down to the developer. So we typically, as developers, will publish to Orchestrator, and then we give that code to these guys who will then publish that to our Git or our DevOps or our version control. Most organizations I've dealt with have a separate process for that. The developer never has access to a production environment except to watch it and monitor the log messages and the triggers and things like that. And even in some instances, the technical architect controls the triggers. And these guys need to turn in, or the business analyst solution architect need to turn in tickets to change the triggers. And that's primarily done for tracking, for audit, and to maintain some sort of control over the entire architectural ecosystem of your RPA program.
Okay. Hey, Chris, are you showing slides right now? Because I'm not seeing them.
Do you want me to?
I didn't know if you were or not. Yeah.
I can see your slides.
Okay.
Do you want me unshare and reshare, Diane?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay. Bear with me. I think this happened earlier today, didn't it?
It happened to me earlier. Yes.
Yeah, hold on. Let me get my sharing thing up. There it is. And let's reshare. Can you see it?
Thanks. Yep.
I think you have a system issue, Diana. You need to work out.
Yep.
Okay. And as I was saying, you may in your organization have a different testing and maintaining center. Your testers may also be maintainers, and this is where development standards come into play, so everybody understands everybody's code. And I will tell you, in very large organizations, I set up a CoE once. It was a centralized CoE, and that CoE had a global footprint, and it was all centered in the Americas in that main corporate CoE. So in that instance, they had their French operations and their German operations and their Irish operations and their Australian operations, all building automations that went to the same orchestrator, was maintained by the same testing and maintaining team. And so they had development standards, even though they were in different languages. This testing and maintaining team, because those development standards, was able to maintain those automations with consulting those other global regions. We'll talk about different ways to set different CoE models in a different session as we talk about scalability. And then here you also may have a maintenance team. Your maintenance team in this instance is going to act kind of like a development team, because they're going to say, okay, your ERP is going up through an upgrade in a year, 2 years, and you need to recode everything. So they may break all those off into a different testing branch in your source control, and you're going through into a test environment into the new ERP instance, and these maintenance people are recoding for that new environment. And you ask me, and I'm sure you're wondering, or some people may be wondering, why don't we have our developers do that? Well, your developers have gone on and they've started building other automations, because if you want, let me back up and let's say in a typical CoE, you want an 85%, 15% ratio, 85% build, 15% maintenance. And if you have a good CoE with good developers, your goal should be a 90% build and a 10% maintenance. We're going to always have maintenance. Systems change, business processes change, especially as you start putting RPA to them. The process will change, people will change. Those individuals you started building for to get adoption, you may move away from that type of model and go into a divisional model or a department model or a cross-functional model, where you're taking it from different divisions of process that crosses different divisions, and you're automating the whole process. So your maintenance team is going to have to be aware of that. They may maintain everything while your developer continues to grow the CoE, work the pipeline. So in a large RPA practice, and large, I probably mean, I worked with an RPA practice myself in my early years where we had over 247 automations in one practice. And in that model, we did have a separate maintenance team, and we had development standards, and that maintenance team continued to maintain those when systems changed, or the business came in with let's say you've gone through your change control process and you've said, okay, if you want this change in your automation, we're going to put it back in the queue for this change only, and we're going to bring it back out and change that process. And that's the role here. This guy has moved on to other things, okay? Unless this guy's wearing multiple hats. And in early CoEs, we often have developers wearing multiple hats. So if you're a maintenance team, if you think about it, they're also working with your businesses and your business analysts. Your solution architect's going to have very little impact or very little say or very little involvement in a maintenance team, because the process has already been built, and now these guys are just maintaining it. I hope I have not confused anybody, and I probably have, and I apologize for that. But if you need me to explain this to you one-on-one, I'd be more than happy to. But let's go to the key roles, these three guys here. As we said, your solution architect is probably one of the most intimately aware of the automation solution and other tools that can be used in the solution. He's involved in all facets of the process except that maintenance facet. This is the guy, the go-to guy. This is the guy that built the solution. This is the guy that spec'd the solution, especially if you're in a consulting team and you're building for another organization. This is the guy that responded to the request for proposal or the request for a quote. This is the guy that evaluated the request that the business had and built the solution around what he or she knew was needed. So this is the guy that's going to be one of the key roles, especially as you start to expand outwards. And we'll talk about some cross-training when it comes to this guy in our next session when we go into architecture, because again, I consider that to be part of a system and not part of a role. Business analysts have a broad understanding of the process, upline dependencies, downline dependencies, what's coming into your automation, what's leaving your automation, where does that output go to? Where does that input come from? Are there system limitations? Is there a normalization of the data that needs to be done? This guy has worked with the business development team and is very much intimately aware of how that business development team does things. He's built the as-is process flow diagram. He's built the process to be diagram where we've input robots into that system. So that's your business analyst. And the business analyst and your developer are going to be best friends throughout the build. And your business. This is your SMEs, your process owner. They're the ones that help the business and the BA develop the testing scripts. They're the ones that approve any changes that need to be approved that you have decided the CoE has agreed to include in the development of this process. They're involved throughout the sales development lifecycle. And if you're operating in an agile environment, these people are probably updated once every 2 weeks on where you're at in your development. And that's very difficult because these people want you to work on their automation now instead of later sometimes, regardless of the prioritization that the steering committee has put on their automation. Because remember, the steering committee has the holistic view of where that automation sits within the organization's mission and impact and goals. So the business can be very pressing. They can be very understanding sometimes, but these three roles are the primary roles in automation development. And you'll notice here the developer is not anymore at least. Developers now, for most developers in many organizations, just build. Have very little say in what they're building. They're going off of a PDD. And like I said, some developers don't care. They're just building because they like to build. They like to code. They like to think of new things while they're coding, bring in new technology, bring in Gen AI, bring in machine learning, document understanding, whatever it might be. So these are your key roles. All right, we're at 3:42. I talked faster than I probably intended to. Questions? Anybody?
So one of the questions we have from Nina is, where does a project manager role fit in the CoE?
Great. So let's talk about that. That guy right here. Let's bring this one back up. So your project manager is different than your solution architect. Your project manager does not need to be intimately familiar with how RPA works. Your project manager needs to be intimately familiar with, if you're in an agile environment, with agile sprints and your features and your stories. Your project manager has to be intimately familiar with the timing and the milestones that you've agreed to. Your project manager is primarily going to be the catalyst of communication between this guy, and these three key roles. Your project manager is going to monitor delays, impediments, blockers in your ability to complete this. So your project manager is important. They understand that they're working in an RPA environment. They understand at a high level what RPA is. They're involved in the testing of RPA. Have you finished the testing on this and this and this? And primarily here, where you notice the solution architect is not involved in maintenance. So let's say you have an ERP upgrade or a third-party solution upgrade or a SaaS solution upgrade, and you have to retest or rebuild a handful of automations, or maybe even 200 automations that interact with one certain ERP, or maybe you're upgrading your entire UiPath program to a new version. You have to retest everything. Your project manager is going to be key in here as far as it is monitoring how much of that retesting you've done, retooling and retesting you've done. What was the success of that retooling and retesting? Do you have to go back and retool more? So your project manager is kind of not ancillary to this, because many organizations don't even have a project manager doing this. Now, in my organization now, we have project managers, and because we deliver to federal agencies, we build for federal agencies. Intelligent automation involves Gen AI and machine learning and things like that, large language models. So our project managers are primarily concerned with resources. Do we have enough resources? Do we need to bring in more resources? Are we meeting our deadlines? Are we behind? Are we ahead? Are we going to complete this earlier? How much travel budget do I have? What is my spend on the travel budget? Your project managers are at a very high level in this process, monitoring the entire process. Now, in some organizations, I worked with an organization where a project manager was only involved when we did upgrades of our UiPath program or our ERP system, and they had to monitor and plan out those sprints and be accountable for those sprints and reporting to their supervisors and the executive committee saying, okay, how far along are we? Are we going to make our deadline? Because in many cases, you may be notified of a ERP system upgrade a year prior to the upgrade, and that project manager has to take that year and plan it out. And it may take you a year, depending on how many automations you have, to upgrade all those automations and retool them and retest them. That's the project manager's role, at least in the world I've lived in and the CoEs I've built. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Anything else?
So Chris, who gathers all the requirements? Is that the solution architect?
The solution architect is part of the kickoff and helps the business analyst during the technical solutioning of the automation. The business requirements are going to be primarily the role of the business analyst.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to remember the solution architect is not just working on this one automation. They're also solutioning other automations in the pipeline that are coming up next, because you may have one developer that's working on this automation. You may have 2 or 3 working on this primarily on this automation, because it may be a very large automation that's cross-functional, what we call cross-functional. It crosses many different departments or agency relationships. So your solution architect is working on other facets of that, or on other automations or other opportunities. Your business analyst is going to be primarily responsible for the entire PDD process, the entire business relationship with this business team, gathering requirements and documentation and testing scripts and things like that. Your developer, his role in the deliverables, once he's done building, he has some limited roles afterwards. He's going to be the one that develops the TDD, the technical design document, that says, okay, these are the UiPath activities I used in the build. These are the nuances I did. These are the codes I invoked. I may have invoked C#. I may have invoked Python into my code, and this is what that's doing. So your developers building out this document, and the goal of this document is to give maintainers, if you don't have a maintainer, or if this developer leaves, other developers or IT folks, a detailed spec of what this automation is doing, and it's more detailed than this guy's. The PDD is more of a process design document, as is to be the steps, known exceptions, unknown possible exceptions. This guy's kind of getting into the minutia and really detailing how this automation works. This guy may also be involved in what we call hypercare and UAT testing. So if you're in UAT testing and you run into something that was not what you expected to happen, and it's part of the PDD, if the developer just plain missed it or misunderstood it, or it's hard to build sometimes from a functional document. This guy will come in during hypercare and testing and maintain that. This developer will also, during hypercare, maintain any changes. And hypercare is in most instances, if you're working with a federal agency, it can be anywhere from 30 to 90 days. In a commercial or on the commercial non-public side, I've seen hypercare last 2 or 3 weeks. I've seen it last 30 days. I've never seen it last 60 to 90 days. But your developers can be involved in hypercare, because hypercare is the promise to the customer that we will devote resources to making sure that once this is released into production, that it is operating in production as we intended it and as we built it to operate and test, because this guy's is typically not building in a production environment. This guy's building in a test environment. Your developers maintain a few roles other than developing, but it can be a limited role in UAT and hypercare, only dependent upon failures or missing the expectations of the original PDD. Not changes to that PDD, because remember, once you start building, you don't change the PDD anymore. Once that developer puts hands on the keyboard, that PDD is set, and changes are very hard to get through unless they are standard changes or emergency changes.
Right. And you have another question from Vithal, who's asking, what is the difference between solution and technical architect?
A solution architect is not going to be, he's going to be aware of what the stack looks like in your organization, but he's not going to be intimately aware. Your technical architect is going to be the ones, if your bots operate in a virtual server where you're logging into a remote desktop protocol, your technical architect is going to be the one that spins up those servers, make sure that those servers have the resources that they need, whether it be an Outlook email or Office 365, or access to different third-party solutions, and that these servers all meet the are mirroring the other server, and that all these servers mirror the server you're building on. A lot of organizations now do not build on a desktop instance of Studio. They build on a server instance of Studio. So the technical architect is involved more intimately with your stack at your organization. A solution architect is more involved with the entire process. Yes, touching a little bit on the technical part, but this person is not always going to be IT trained. Like I said, this person could be a developer that has been developing for some time, knows how to solution automation. So I'll use me as an example. I am not a technical architect guy. I can go into a server and I can maintain a server. I cannot spin up a server. I cannot install things like BigFix and things like that on a server. I have no clue how to do that. And probably I will never have a desire to know how to do that. But I can solution an RFQ or an RFP or an automation request. I can go through and know what we have available and what we can and cannot do. I can gather the right resources on the team. I can present it to the steering committee, because that's what your solution architect is doing, is presenting that and the solution to your team. And I can work with the BA and determine how long it will take and what's involved and the complications, things like that. So I'm involved with the entire solution, and a technical architect is someone I rely upon to maintain the stack and that infrastructure that's needed for me to achieve the goal of automating that solution. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was good.
Nothing else?
One more question. Do we have a special course in RPA to become technical architect like we have an RPA solution architect?
Yeah, we used to. I don't know if it's still there. It's called the infrastructure professional infrastructure architect. Now, in my world, and we'll talk about this in the training roadmap, I recommend any developer to be also a business analyst professional certified. That's just my world. I mean, I'll explain that in our next session. But yes, we used to have an infrastructure architect certification in UiPath. I don't know if it's still there, because I don't intend on taking it, to be quite honest with you. It's not something I'm interested in. but the last time I knew it was there. I think the only one that we've decommissioned recently is going to be the one involving SAP, if I'm not mistaken, in the UiPath. And I work with the Academic Alliance all the time. I think that's the only one that is going away, is the SAP one. And I may be wrong about that, but I think that's it. The other certifications, and we'll talk about those on the next session, would be specialized AI if you're using machine learning, autopilot, and then a solution architect. And if you're a developer that wants to get into being a solution architect, being a solution architect is much more stressful. And I recommend not having a solution architect that has not developed RPA automations before, because a solution architect that has developed before is much more keenly aware of what it takes to build and the sprints that will be needed and the complexity of an automation as it bears down on the shoulders of a developer. But I recommend anybody that's a developer, UIR, or I guess it's called associate professional developer now, or no, wait, professional automation developer now instead of UIR, to venture into that solution architect coursework. It's difficult. It's intensive, but it's very helpful if you want, even if you just want to stay a developer, at least you understand the roles that everybody's playing. It's never a bad thing to be too certified, right?
Yeah.
Anything else? Look, I may give you back some time today, right? I may give you back 4 minutes.
Wow. Yeah, I think that was it. Good questions, you guys.
All right. I will see you Monday when we're going to talk about architecture systems, training roadmaps, and certifications.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for presenting today, and thank you, everybody, for attending.
Not a problem.